Let's talk a bit about the limits of technology, because I think one of the things that makes you stand out in the Silicon Valley scene is that you're much more skeptical than is typical of technology per se. And one of your most famous quotable quotes is, and I want to get it right, "We were promised flying cars, and instead what we got was 140 characters." It's hard to believe that Twitter has solved a profound problem of the human condition, and yet it's an enormously successful company about which you have had occasion to say somewhat critical things, and not only that one I just quoted. So how should we understand a phenomenon like Twitter? Is it a massive breakthrough for mankind that we can now insult one another electronically as long as we can get the insult into 140 characters?
Well, I think we always are trying to tell stories of specific and general success or specific and general failure. So Solyndra blew up, therefore no clean tech thing will ever work. Or look at how valuable Twitter is as a company. It's, has a 20 billion plus market cap, and that must show how much the information age is going to change the world. And I tend to think we should often separate the specific and the general story. So I do think that Twitter is a quite successful business, and I think in the same breath one could say that it's not remotely enough to take our civilization to the next level. There are a lot of great specific successes in Silicon Valley. At the end of the day, I think we're better off with them than without them. So I'm not against them in any sense, but I am a little bit skeptical of the generalization. And the general question, that's a very hard one to answer, is how much technological progress is generally happening. And I do think that the sort of Kurzweil utopia, exponential curves everywhere. We have exponentiating, dizzying rates of progress. All you need to do is sit back and eat popcorn and watch the movie of the future unfold. That strikes me as certainly somewhat off. I think the story of technological progress in recent decades has been sort of a tale of two worlds. There's been the world of bits, computers, internet, mobile internet, software, where I do think we've seen very significant progress. And then I think most other areas that would have been counted as technology in the 1950s and 1960s have seen much less rapid progress, if any at all. And that would include everything from biotech, medical devices, energy,
flying cars,
supersonic aviation, space travel. There's been some progress in some of these areas, but certainly not anywhere remotely as much as people would have expected from the vantage point of, say, the late 1960s.
And how do you explain that? Why is it that the things that, maddeningly, you're 3 years younger than me, that's the most annoying thing, actually, quite apart from the money. But
that's never going to change.
But it's never going to change. Plus, you will probably live to be 150. It's just too galling. But if we just go back to that time when we were growing up and reading comics and reading science fiction and reading about the future, it did promise us not only flying cars, but much else besides. And yet we only seem to really have got the dramatic breakthroughs in information technology. Why is that?
Well, I think almost every question that starts with the word "why" is an incredibly difficult to answer question. And if I had to speculate, I suspect the causes are somewhat overdetermined. There are probably a number of different kinds of reasons. Politically, I'm somewhat libertarian, where everything that goes wrong gets blamed on the government, and so the libertarian explanation would be that the world of bits has been very unregulated, the world of atoms has been very regulated, and so if the Food and Drug Administration was regulating video games as aggressively as it regulated pharmaceuticals, and if we had to do a double-blind study to see whether video games did damage to your brain or not before they could be approved, I suspect we would have had a lot less progress in video games in recent decades than we've had. So I do think there's a regulatory story that one could tell. And this applies certainly to areas of energy like nuclear power and on and on. I think there is probably there's probably the liberal explanation tends to focus on education, that we're not prioritizing enough science, math, engineering education, that more needs to be done there. I think there are some cultural explanations where people become more risk averse. They become generally scared of technology. I do think there's a there's a broad cultural sense in which I think our society in general is anti-technological. It doesn't sort of explicitly say that, but the easiest way to show this is if you simply look at all the movies that come out of Hollywood. I always challenge people to come up with a single science fiction film that portrays the technological future in a positive light. They all portray it as dystopian, non-functional, dangerous for people, and the future is some combination of the Terminator movies with robots running around, the Matrix where we're sort of, just hooked up to these machines. It's Avatar, it's Elysium. I watched the Gravity movie the other day. You would never want to go into outer space. You would be so happy to be back on a muddy tropical island somewhere. And so I do think the dominant ethos in our culture is very anti-scientific, very anti-technological. But in a way, this also makes me optimistic because I think the slowdown, whatever reason it's happened, it's not been a law of nature that we just run out of ideas and the cupboard is bare. I think it's much more regulatory, cultural, much more of these other contingent factors, which are perhaps somewhat of an indictment of the baby boom generation, but are also things that I think we could theoretically change if we wanted to.
It is interesting, isn't it, the way Hollywood does that and generally pits the sort of primitive man against the elaborate, sophisticated androids. But the only exception I can ever really think of in this regard is a very British one, and that's the character of Doctor who is a superhero with a brain who uses his technological advantages to defeat relatively primitive, though sometimes quite deadly monsters. But Doctor Who has never taken off and never been versioned in the United States.
Well, I think of that as a 50s, 60s retread. So you could say the same of the early Star Trek films.
Yeah.
They were quite positive. So I think I don't think science fiction in the 50s and 60s was universally optimistic, but I think there was a 50s, 60s version that was quite optimistic. It would have been Doctor Who in Britain, Star Trek in the US.
Let's talk about globalization, which you touched on earlier. I was reading just the other day an article you wrote in 2007, pre-crisis article. Let me quote from it. "There are no good investments in a 21st century where globalization fails. The real alternative to good globalization is world war." So although you prefer 0 to 1 technology to 1 to 2, which is essentially globalization, just scaling something that was already there, you're still a fan of globalization.
I don't think you could be against globalization. Or it's very, it's unclear what it means.
People are.
Well, but I think
read The Guardian.
Well, but I think most anti-globalization movements are, they're sort of they end up being some sort of self-contradictory farce, like a global conference of anti-globalization activists, or maybe it's really a cover for a worldwide communist revolution or something like that. But so I think there's something deeply paradoxical about these sort of stated anti-globalization movements. In practice, less globalization would mean a world in which there's less trade, in which the world breaks apart, probably a more violent world. There's a case you can make that 1913 was a high point of globalization, and then it went in reverse for decades, starting with World War I. 1949, China became communist. A quarter of the world seceded. Humanity seceded from the rest of the world, and globalization didn't really begin in earnest again, I would argue, till maybe the Kissinger trip to China in 1971. So I do think that it can go very much in reverse. What I suspect has happened, this is always not that easy to precisely quantify, is that there's been so much stress on globalization and not enough on innovation that there are questions how well it can work on its own. If you have 1 billion people living in the developed world, 6 billion people living in the developing countries, if they continue to progress at a breakneck pace, does this put undue strain on resources? Does it does it set you up for conflict? And certainly, even though I think again there's no good future in which China is not integrated into the world economy, in which China does not progress, if it does it on current technology, doesn't that just mean astronomical prices for fuel, food, and other things if everyone in China had a car like in the U.S.?
So if I were George Monbiot, whom I went to Oxford with, indeed shared a house with, who's now one of the Guardian's most left-of-centre columnists, who frequently denounces globalization, I would say something like this. Ah, you would say that because you're a billionaire beneficiary of globalization, but what about all those people whose jobs are being destroyed by the payment of subsistence wages in sweatshops in Bangladesh? What about the victims of globalization who are suffering from the externalities of unclean, unpolluted air in the developing world? I mean, is there a way of countering that kind of argument that you're a beneficiary? You would say that, wouldn't you?
Well, there's always an ad hominem argument that's not clear how you counter pure ad hominem arguments. But I would say in the developed world there have been very powerful shear forces caused by globalization, but it's not because it's only one half of the equation that jobs have been outsourced. The real challenge is that they have not been replaced with new jobs, and this is why I think new technologies are far more critical for the developed world than the developing world. China has maybe China runs into resource or environmental constraints, but it has sort of a relatively straightforward pattern. It's going to just keep copying things that work, skip a few steps here and there, and maybe that works, maybe it breaks sooner than people think. But China has a very straightforward plan. If you're in Western Europe or the U.S., if the younger generation is to have a better future than the current generation, it requires them to do new things. And if you sort of think about the way we talk about the world, in the 50s and 60s, it was a pro-technology with not so much globalization going on, and you split the world into the first world and the third world. First world was that part that was technologically accelerating. The third world was that part that was sort of permanently screwed up. Today, the world is divided into developed and developing, which is a pro-globalization convergence theory of history dichotomy, but is also implicitly an anti-technological characterization, because when we say that we're living in the developed world, we're saying sotto voce that we're living in that part of the world that's finished, done, where nothing new is going to happen, where everything was done in the past, and where the younger generation should resign itself to reduced expectations for the future.
Is that Europe?
It's certainly Europe. In many ways, feels like, I think one can exaggerate the differences between Europe, Japan, and the U.S., but certainly this sort of pessimism about the hopes for the younger generation are, I think, most acute in continental Europe.
You were born in Germany, and you've recently made some investments in Berlin companies.
So not very many.
Not very many, okay. Not very big.
But anyway,
you've done it. So you spend time in Europe, and you think a lot about its problems. We're sitting here in London, which is still, at least for the time being, a part of Europe. Do you have a sense?
That's a very debatable proposition. Yeah.
Well, we'll come to that. I want to end with a question about London. Do you have a sense that Europe has a way out of this stagnation? Because if secular stagnation, which is a popular phrase of the moment thanks to my former boss, Larry Summers, if secular stagnation has any real power as an idea, it seems to me to apply well to Europe. Is there a way out of that stagnation that one sees here?
I agree with Summers on the stagnation thesis generally. I disagree with his diagnosis where it's a demand-side problem. And so if you view it as a problem on the demand side, then it means you should print money, or if you're done printing money, you should have governments borrow money like crazy. And so you sort of somehow have this Keynesian monetary or fiscal stimulus. I think of it as a supply-side problem, and I think the solution to stagnation is to be able to do new things and invent new things. And then the question is, why is that so hard to do? Why is that not happening enough? And we get back to the why question you asked before. But yeah, culturally, Europe seems very stuck on the supply side, and people are seem to be much more interested in finding strange scapegoats to blame for their problems than really going about building a better future.